I'd like to begin this hearing first noting that in President Obama's press conference with Raul Castro yesterday, Raul Castro said that there were no political prisoners, daring people to come up with a list of political prisoners in Cuba. I have in my hand a list of more than 50 political prisoners compiled by my good friend Ileana Ros-Lehtinen from information provided by a number of democracy and human rights organizations. And without objection, I would like to make that list part of the record. On one of those people is Alexander Reyes, sentenced to 5 years in prison on March 2nd of 2016, just a few days ago. His crime, tossing flyers with anti-government messages on the street. In fact, to punish him further, he went from one prison to the notorious Kilo 8 prison. And then there's the example of Yaciel Espinono Avila, who went on a hunger strike last year in protest of the abuses and torture meted out to political prisoners by the Castro brothers goons. And just this past Sunday, hours before the President Obama was to arrive in Cuba, Baptist pastor and religious freedom activist, the Reverend Mario Felix Leonard Barroso, was arrested by the regime, by the Castro regime, as well as his wife, Yoaxis, who was placed under house arrest. So again, without objection, we'll make those a part of the record. I want to welcome you to today's hearing, Getting It Right this time, a victim-centered trafficking in persons report, at which we will look closely at the records of several countries, including Cuba, China, Malaysia, Oman, and Burma, and others, whose trafficking tier rankings were manipulated and falsified for political reasons in last year's report. As the prime sponsor of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, America's landmark law to combat human trafficking, which among its many policy provisions created the Trafficking in Persons Report and the tier rankings, I am extremely disappointed and concerned that last year's TIP report gave a pass to several countries meriting Tier 3 accountability, countries whose trafficking victims desperately needed protection in America's powerful voice. The 2015 TIP report failed many of the victims, and the victims deserve better. The politically contrived passing grade for failing governments was exposed by a series of investigative reports by Reuters. And I and many others and anyone involved in human rights are grateful to Reuters for those articles. And they found that the professionals at the State Department, at the TIP office, made one set of recommendations only to be overruled at a higher level for political reasons. For example, the TIP office recommended Tier 3 ranking for Cuba, China, Malaysia, and Oman, 14 countries in all, which was rejected by the Obama administration at a higher level in last year's report. Each of the 14 countries were then given passing grades. Alexander Harney, Jason Zepp, and Matt Spedlnick of Reuters authored several incisive reports, including an expose on China's politicized ranking, finding, and I quote, 2 years after China announced it was ending the re-education through labor system, extrajudicial networks of detention facilities featuring torture and forced labor thrive in its place, close quote. China had deceived the United States in 2014 about this intention, and when that became apparent last year, we let them keep on with their ill-gotten upgrade on the tier ranking. The State Department must get the TIP report right, or we will lose the foundational tool created by the TPVA to help the more than 20 million victims of trafficking enslaved around the world. In the end, the Trafficking in Persons report is all about victims. The threshold question must be, as Ambassador Mark P. Legon included in his 2008 TIP report, a country's performance is based strictly on the trafficking-specific criteria stipulated by the TVPA. A tier ranking is about protecting vulnerable lives, lives destroyed or saved by the on-the-ground impact of a government's action or inaction. We have seen many countries take a Tier 3 ranking seriously and make real, systemic, and sustainable changes that improve their tier rankings, but more importantly, protected trafficking victims. And countries such as South Korea and Israel come to mind. When the Bush administration branded South Korea and Israel, two of our closest allies, but based on their records, branded them as Tier 3, both countries reacted and enacted and implemented robust policies to combat human trafficking, and were given earned upgrades for their verifiable actions. But today we've seen other countries attempt an end around the accountability system with endless empty promises of action or mostly meaningless gestures of compliance. Congress in 2003 created the Tier 2 watch list for those countries, which may have undertaken significant anti-trafficking steps late in the evaluation year. Unfortunately, this ranking is being misused to reward insignificant actions and to enable irresponsibility. How would the 16-year-old girl being pimped legally in Cuba's sex tourism industry rank Cuba on human trafficking? I can assure you, not with a politically motivated passing grade. How would the Rohingya migrant trapped in Malaysian forced labor rank Malaysia when his trafficker laughs at the mention of penalties? How would the sex trafficking victim forced to do labor in a Chinese detention center year after year or be sent back to torture and death in North Korea rank China? How would a young boy rank Burma, where he has been forced to labor for the military while his sister is turned into a modern-day comfort woman? Tier rankings are about real prosecutions, real prevention, and real protection for real people who are suffering as slaves. Cuba is an egregious example of a nation being given an unwarranted passing grade because of other non-human trafficking considerations. Just read the report. The report leads you to the inevitable conclusion: stamp it, Tier 3, egregious violator. Yet, President Obama is there today hobnobbing with the very people who are kept in power by the profits of slave labor, the very people who do not have a law against labor trafficking, because of course it doesn't exist, the very people whose hotels are filled with sex tourists who come to Cuba specifically to sexually exploit minors. My latest trafficking law, it's the fourth so far, the International Megan's Law, fights sex tourism, but assumes a willing, non-profiting partner country. Some tourists go to Cuba because Cuba facilitates sex trafficking. Cuba also harbors criminals. Just ask the family of Warner Forrester, a New Jersey state trooper who was gunned down at a traffic stop by Joanne Chesimard. Cuba protects Chesimard to this day. Maria Verlaw will testify this afternoon that, and I quote, "What makes the Cuban case unique as well as astounding is that trafficking is a huge operation run by the government through numerous state enterprises with accomplices, participants, sponsors, and promoters all over the world. And that the Cuban dictatorship is involved in, quote, 4 main sources of human trafficking: export services for temporary workers, forced labor and sex trafficking, state-sponsored or forced migration, and export sales of human and body parts." Our State Department Trafficking in Persons report, however, addresses only 2 of these aspects, and in my view, does it quite poorly, she says in her testimony. The trafficking rankings should not be used as cheap chits and sweeteners that could be compromised in the hope of bringing about better governmental relations with Cuba or any other nation. Rather, better relations with Cuba or any other nation should be preconditioned on real protection for Cuba's prostituted children and women and recognition of labor trafficking. The President, it seems to me, is lending his stature, particularly as a Nobel Peace Prize winner, to the very people who are imprisoning human rights advocates at a higher rate than ever. Cuba's actions prove once again that lifting accountability only emboldens evil. The TIP report was meant to hold countries accountable for their failures to fight human trafficking. It was meant to speak truth to power. It was meant to speak for the trafficking victims, waiting, hoping, and praying for relief. In 2016, the TIP report must rank the governments on a country's performance that is based on the trafficking-specific criteria as Ambassador Legon has said, stipulated by the TVPA. Every ranking must be assigned without, I repeat, without any political manipulation and without any dishonesty. Get the tiers right in 2016. The lives of many of the weakest and the most vulnerable, and U.S. credibility hang in the balance. I'd like to yield to Mark Meadows for any comments he might have.